to the channel. This is Imaginary Money.
For decades, world trade has been dominated by the dollar.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world.
The SWIFT system, that actually became weaponized by the U.S.
The Monetary Authority of Singapore and the People's Bank of China have renewed the bilateral currency swap arrangement.
Saudi Arabia is in discussions with China to price some of its oil sales in yuan.
But as ties with Washington continue to be strained, Beijing and Moscow are diversifying.
China and Russia had taken another step closer towards dumping the dollar and agreed to trade in their respective national currencies, the Russian ruble and the Chinese yuan.
The American dollar has been the most powerful currency for several decades in the entire world. It is obvious that having such a powerful currency will give America an upper hand in all its financial state affairs. Trades, transactions, and petrodollars in form of bond investments are some of the advantages the value of dollars have brought to the U.S. Dollar gives the U.S. the power to destroy the economy of an entire country in a split second, allowed it to rule over other major economies like that of Russia and China. Both of these countries are huge and have strategic planning, just like the U.S., but they are still defeated in the form of currency by the power of the dollar. But this is where China and Russia are planning to take down the extraordinary power of the U.S. dollar and throne their own currency at the top. Russia and China have been planning this strategy for a long time, and recent statistical analysis shows that their strategy is working. The data on the US dollar in the world market currencies shows that the US dollar had a 71% share in the global market reserve currencies by the year 1999. But recently, in the past decade, this share is rapidly decreasing. The share has dropped to even less than 59%. This supposedly predicts that China and Russia's plan to dethrone the dollar will work out, and a new currency in the form of yuan take the throne of being the most powerful currency in the world in the near future. Now the question is, what kind of strategy Russia and China are using to kill the power of the dollar? How will they take the status of the most powerful currency, and what challenges will they meet? Because you know, cryptocurrency and Bitcoin is overthrowing everything. In order to understand this phenomenon better, we first need to find the reason why the US dollar have such immense power over other currencies. During the 90s, the US tried various tactics to cement the dollar at the position where it is now. The US used about 3 major tactics that served in its currency favor. First, the US was to establish dollars as a reserved currency of trust. In the year 1994, the U.S. claimed that if any country had dollars, it would exchange its value with gold at the rate of $35 per ounce of gold. This gave countries that do not trust each other a way to trade with one another due to the power of the dollar. This eased the trade way between many countries. For instance, when Indonesia took $1 million from Pakistan in dollars, even if they did not trust the country, they had the assurity that $1 million can be exchanged with the U.S. for gold. But if they traded directly with Pakistan in the currency of rupees, it would have been risky. 10,000 rupees bought them 1 gram of gold if they exchanged it in the US. And if the value of rupees decreased, then 20,000 rupees will be required to buy 1 gram of gold from the US. In this way, the entire currency could have been devalued by 50%, and it would have collapsed the Indonesian trade market. Secondly, if Indonesia directly traded with rupees and other countries did not trust the currency, then they would not be able to trade with countries in the currency of rupees. The same was not the case with dollars. Many countries trusted the dollar trade, and moreover, the trade money could be exchanged for gold from the US. But in 1971, Richard Nixon stated,
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. The effect of this action, in other words, will be to stabilize the dollar.
After the abolishment of the conversion of the dollar into gold, the dollar still had a massive advantage. The dollar was the only currency that could be used to purchase oil from Saudi Arabia. Because in 1945, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt made a 100-year agreement with then Saudi King. In that agreement, the president guaranteed the security of Saudi Arabia. In exchange, the Saudis sell their oil in dollars. It might not sound like an effective or powerful deal, but it boosted the power of the dollar a lot. With this agreement, if any country wanted oil, it rushed to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, since it has the largest oil reservoir in the world. But in order to purchase the oil, the country needed to have dollars. This is the second major reason for the dominance of the dollar in the trade market. These two advantages lead to America's third and biggest superpower. America's power of dollars largely owes to SWIFT network. A SWIFT network works with dollars stored in the U.S. bank accounts. In this way, if an Indonesian trader wanted to trade with a Sri Lankan trader, the SWIFT network would have the Indonesian trader, an Indonesian bank, one American bank, then another American bank, Sri Lankan bank, and the Sri Lankan trader in its network. The key takeaway is that both countries have their own separate American banks where the money is stored in dollars. If any Indonesian company wanted to import any commodity from any Sri Lankan company, it will pay the amount for import to its own bank. The bank will then transfer the money to the American bank where it is converted into dollars. The other American bank takes that amount and gives it to the Sri Lankan bank. The bank converts the dollars into Sri Lankan currency and will pay the Sri Lankan company. This is how the SWIFT network operates. Currently, 200 plus countries work with US dollars during trade and have their money stored in US banks. For instance, if any country has $100 billion reserved in American banks and spends $30 billion in trade, its balance will be $70 billion. Such financially stable countries invest their excess funds in the U.S. Treasury bonds. Many countries invest in the mega bonds of America at a large scale and expect a return on the funds invested after maturity. This gives the U.S. dollar unprecedented power. As of September 2021, the U.S. held $7 trillion from foreign investors as bond investments. This amount is even more than the GDP of France, India, and Russia all together. These excess $7 trillion bonds have investments by the U.S. and are called petrodollars. The three major factors discussed earlier give the dollar unmatched power. But both Russia and China have a problem with this. China resents the U.S. for supporting Taiwan, and similarly, Russia is the most sanctioned country by the UN. With these sanctions, Russia cannot use American banks to trade in dollars, and the majority of Russian companies have been removed by the SWIFT network. Now, both countries have joined hands and have set up gameplay to destroy the power of the US dollar. And how do both of them intend to do that? Russia is one of the largest oil and gas producers in the world, apart from Saudi Arabia. Russia forces the countries to buy their oil in the currency of rubles. In this way, most of the European countries had to buy oil in rubles, which meant that these countries had to keep their reserves in the Russian central bank. In this way, Russia intends to uplift its economy with the ruble reserve, just like the US did with the dollar reserves. This points to the direction of the rise of petro-ruble. Russia has been planning to get rid of the dollar since 2014. The graph of US treasuries in Russia has gone down from $150 billion in 2013 to just $3.9 billion in 2021. China also has a major advantage, just like Russia, with its BRI, Belt and Road Initiatives countries. This is a $3 trillion project in which China has given loans to financially struggling countries all over the world. Under the BRI project, 165 countries have taken loans from China and collectively owe China a debt of $385 billion. The majority of the countries have taken so many loans from China that they cannot pay them back. The most recent examples of such countries are Pakistan and Sri Lanka. This gives China a huge advantage over these countries. China is planning to ask the countries to take and pay back those loans in China's currency of yuan. And in exchange, China can give them a 1% discount on their interest. This is a huge deal for many financially struggling countries. Moreover, since the initiative of the BRI loans, China has issued 14% of loans in its own currency without any need for dollars. Furthermore, in 2018, Pakistan had already agreed to conduct trade with China in the currency of yuan, and many other countries like Myanmar, Cambodia, and Russia have agreed to trade in yuan as well. To top it all off, China is currently the largest trade partner with 25 BRI countries. This gives the monopoly of trade to China. This way, China can force all 165 countries to conduct trade and pay back loans in yuan instead of dollars, forming a huge network and breaking the power that the dollar currently holds. Now the question arises, how will China make rich and financially independent countries like South Korea and England give up trade in dollars? This leads to our next point. Firstly, Russia, a literal superpower, has agreed to reserve trade in yuan. For other countries, China has something called the Bilateral Currency Swap Agreement. In simple words, it is like the SWIFT network set up but without the dollars. Let's take an example. If two countries like China and England make the bilateral currency swap agreement for 5 years for a total of $1 million, this means that both countries will give one another their own currency amount, which is equivalent to $1 million. China will give 1 million worth of yuan to England, and England will give China 1 million worth of pounds. So for the designated years, China can sell the given pounds to them and get dollars, or it can invest those pounds in its own domestic companies in form of loans. And the same goes for England. Before this agreement, if any businessman in England wanted to buy 1 million worth of yuan from a China businessman, he would have to go through the SWIFT system. He would have to pay 1 million yuan worth of pounds to the England bank, which would then transfer the amount to the American bank, where it is converted into dollars. Then the amount passes through another American bank, and then finally into the Chinese bank. Then the Chinese bank would pay the price to the Chinese businessman. This process involved a lot of lengthy and unnecessary steps. But after this agreement, the England businessman would simply take 1 million yuan from England's bank and pay it to the Chinese bank in England, which would send the 1 million yuan to China's bank, and the bank would pay the Chinese businessman the money. Through this agreement, trade pathways were made shorter and more efficient. As you can see, with the bilateral currency swap agreement, two countries can trade without one another without the dependency on dollars. This agreement gives both countries three major advantages. Firstly, they can trade more economically. Secondly, they can eliminate the exchange risk. And thirdly, they can use their currencies for dollar exchange. In this way, trade between both countries grows stronger and the dependency on dollars dies. In fact, Beijing has signed more than 3 trillion worth of bilateral currency swap agreements with 40 countries. Some of these agreements include 400 billion yuan with Hong Kong, 400 billion yuan with South Korea, 350 yuan each with European Central Bank and England, 300 billion yuan with Singapore, and 150 billion yuan with Russia. Another huge advantage China is going to get is that Saudi Arabia is thinking of selling its oil in yuan. This means that China would gain the same advantage that the US had. This means that China would gain the same advantage that US had if Saudi Arabia sells oil in yuan. The majority of countries will buy yuan in order to purchase oil, much as they did with the dollars, ultimately boosting the currency of China. Furthermore, the countries will start to invest their excess forex in Chinese bond investments, just like they did with the US bond investments. This will give all the advantages the US dollar had to China and will cement yuan as the top currency in the world, giving a monopoly to China in world trade. On paper, the strategy of China seems pretty powerful and effective, but in reality, China will face a lot of problems in overthrowing the strongest currency in the world. China and Russia both have a huge problem in terms and of their reputation. China is not seen as a reliable country with death trap diplomacy and its loans in the Taiwan invasion. Similarly, Russia does not hold much power in the West. Secondly, China has been devaluing the yuan too frequently. The US also accused China of committing currency manipulation. In addition to that, China is seen as a shady nation and not as clear as the US. Lastly, the US is aware of China's efforts to dethrone the dollar and has enough military and money to push aside the currency of China. And that is all for today. Like this video if you found it informational. Do you think China is on track to devaluing the dollar? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe to our channel for more content like this, and we'll see you guys soon with some new information. This is Imaginary Money.